The muddy waters of the Brazos River churned angrily as Hannah Adams watched in horror, her scream piercing through the thundering rainfall like a knife. Her 3-year-old son Timothy had been playing near the riverbank when the ground beneath him collapsed, sending him into the raging torrent. Now, all she could see was his tiny hand reaching up from the brown water before disappearing downstream. Colorado Territory, 1872. Spring had arrived with vengeance, bringing floods that transformed the normally placid Brazos into a monster that devoured everything in its path. The town of Belmont sat precariously on its banks, and today the river had claimed its newest victim. Timothy. Timothy. Hannah's voice grew hoarse as she ran along the riverbank, her skirts heavy with mud, her golden hair plastered to her face by the relentless rain. 19 years old and widowed just months earlier when her husband died of pneumonia, Hannah had nothing left in the world but her son. And now the river was taking him too. Ahead, she could see the bend where the Brazos turned sharply, creating a natural dam of debris. People from town had gathered there, alerted by her screams. Among them was a tall figure who moved differently from the rest, purposeful, determined, watching the water with an intensity that matched her own desperation. Ethan Blackwell stood at the edge of the swollen river, his calculating eyes tracing the current's path. 25 years old with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work, he had been in town delivering cattle when the commotion began. Now he stripped off his leather vest and gun belt, handing them to the blacksmith beside him. "You can't go in there, Blackwell," warned the blacksmith, Morgan Jenkins. "That current'll snap your neck against the rocks before you get 10 feet. See that logjam?" Ethan pointed downstream where branches and debris had collected. "The boy'll get caught there if he hasn't already. Might be a pocket of air underneath." Hannah reached the gathering crowd, her chest heaving. "Please, my son. He's only 3. She grabbed the sleeve of Ethan's shirt, her fingers digging into the wet fabric. "Please, someone help him." Ethan met her eyes for the first time, hers wild with fear, his steady and determined. "I'll find him, madam." Without another word, he removed his boots and dove into the churning water. The current immediately swept him downstream, but his powerful strokes kept him from being smashed against the rocks lining the riverbank. The townspeople followed along the shore, watching as his head disappeared beneath the surface, then reappeared several yards later. Hannah ran faster than anyone, ignoring the brambles tearing at her dress, her eyes never leaving the flashes of Ethan's white shirt in the muddy water. When he reached the logjam, he disappeared beneath it. "He's gone under," someone shouted. Seconds stretched into minutes. Hannah stood frozen, her heart suspended between beats. The rain continued to fall, but the world had gone silent for her. Then a disturbance in the water. Ethan's arm appeared, then his head, gasping for air, and clutched against his chest was a small, motionless form. "Timothy." Hannah screamed, wading into the shallows where Ethan was fighting to reach the bank. Several men rushed in to help, pulling both Ethan and the child to safety. Timothy's face was pale, his lips blue. He wasn't breathing. "No, no, no," Hannah sobbed, dropping to her knees beside her son's still form. "Please, God, no." Ethan coughed up river water, then crawled to the boy's side. "Move back," he instructed Hannah, his voice hoarse but firm. With practiced movements, he turned Timothy onto his side, patting his back firmly. Water dribbled from the child's mouth, but he remained motionless. "Come on, boy," Ethan murmured, now pressing on the child's chest with careful pressure. "Breathe." Hannah watched, her entire existence narrowed to the space between her son's heartbeats. The crowd had fallen silent, men removing their hats in grim anticipation of another tragedy. Then, a miracle. Timothy's small body convulsed, and he coughed violently, water streaming from his mouth. His eyes fluttered open, confused and frightened. "Mama," he whimpered. Hannah gathered him into her arms, sobbing with relief. "I'm here, baby, I'm here." She looked up at Ethan, who had collapsed back onto the wet ground, exhausted. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Ethan nodded, too spent for words. But his eyes, when they met Hannah's, held something that neither of them could have anticipated: a recognition, a connection forged in the crucible of near disaster. Neither knew it then, but the Brazos River, which had nearly taken everything from Hannah, had instead delivered something unexpected. Hope. Dr. Samuel Wilson pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched tightly. "Let me see the boy," he insisted, kneeling beside Hannah and Timothy. While the doctor examined Timothy, Hannah couldn't help but glance at Ethan, who was now sitting up, accepting a blanket from someone in the crowd. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and a cut above his eye was bleeding freely, mixing with the river water dripping down his face. "Your son is lucky," Dr. Wilson announced after a few minutes. "His lungs sound clear, but I want him warm and in bed immediately. Watch for fever. I'll come by later tonight to check on him." Hannah nodded, cradling Timothy close. "My cabin is nearly a mile from here," she said, the reality of her situation sinking in. Her horse was back at the general store, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to carry Timothy all that way. "I'll take you," Ethan said, rising to his feet. Despite his own exhaustion, he moved with purpose, retrieving his boots and gear. "Mr. Blackwell, you need rest yourself," Dr. Wilson cautioned. "I'll rest when they're home safe," Ethan replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He whistled sharply, and a large buckskin horse trotted over from where it had been ground tied near the general store. Hannah hesitated. "We've imposed on you enough, Mr. Blackwell." "Ethan," he corrected, securing his gun belt. "And it's no imposition, madam. Storm's getting worse, and the boy needs shelter." As if to emphasize his point, lightning cracked overhead, followed by a rumble of thunder that made Timothy whimper and burrow deeper into his mother's embrace. "Thank you, Ethan," Hannah said, accepting his help as he lifted both her and Timothy onto his horse before mounting behind them. The ride to Hannah's small cabin on the outskirts of Belmont was tense and silent. Timothy had fallen into an exhausted sleep against Hannah's chest, while she was acutely aware of Ethan's presence behind her, one arm around her waist to keep them secure on the horse, the other holding the reins. The storm continued unabated, but Hannah found herself strangely protected within the circle of Ethan's arms. When they reached the modest cabin, Ethan dismounted first, then helped Hannah down with Timothy still clutched to her chest. The boy barely stirred. "Let me get a fire going," Ethan said once they were inside. The cabin was cold and dark, evidence of Hannah's hasty departure for town earlier that day. While Hannah changed Timothy into dry clothes and tucked him into the small bed they shared, Ethan efficiently built a fire in the stone hearth. Soon, warmth began to fill the single-room cabin, and the soft glow of firelight pushed back the storm's gloom. "He's sleeping now," Hannah said, emerging from behind the privacy screen that separated the sleeping area from the rest of the room. She changed into a simple blue dress, her wet hair combed back and beginning to dry in loose waves. "I can't thank you enough for what you did today." Ethan stood by the fire, his own clothes still damp. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Hannah said firmly. "They wouldn't have. The others were afraid, you weren't." A slight smile touched Ethan's lips. "I was plenty afraid, madam, just more afraid of not trying." Hannah moved to a small chest in the corner and withdrew a man's shirt and trousers. "These were my husband's. They might fit you well enough until your clothes dry." Ethan accepted them with a nod. "Your husband's not." He died last winter, pneumonia. Hannah's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the pain still fresh. It's just Timothy and me now. I'm sorry for your loss, Ethan said simply. While Ethan changed behind the screen, Hannah prepared coffee, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. Her mind, however, kept returning to the moment she'd seen Timothy in Ethan's arms, both of them pulled from the river. The memory made her hands shake, and she nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Careful there," Ethan said, emerging in her late husband's clothes, which fit him surprisingly well. He took the pot from her trembling hands and set it on the table. "Sit down before you fall down, Mrs. Adams." "Hannah," she corrected, sinking gratefully into a chair. "After what you did today, I think we can dispense with formalities." Ethan poured them both coffee, then sat across from her. In the firelight, she could see the cut above his eye more clearly, a jagged gash that was still seeping blood. "You're hurt," she said, rising quickly to fetch a cloth and her small tin of healing salve. "Let me tend to that." Ethan started to protest, but fell silent when Hannah dipped the cloth in warm water and gently began to clean the wound. Her touch was light but sure, and he found himself studying her face as she worked. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably not yet 20, with delicate features framed by golden hair that curled as it dried. Despite the hardship evident in her cabin's sparse furnishings and the pain of recent widowhood, there was a resilience to her that impressed him. "How long have you been in Belmont?" he asked as she applied the salve. "Just over a year. Jacob, my husband, brought us here from Missouri. He had dreams of starting a ranch." Hannah's voice softened at the memory. "We bought this land, but then he got sick before we could do much with it." "And you stayed on," Hannah nodded. "Where would I go? Back to Missouri, to parents who disowned me for marrying beneath my station." "No, this is home now, for better or worse." Ethan was silent for a moment, considering. "It's hard country for a woman alone." "I'm learning to manage," Hannah said with a hint of defensiveness. "We get by." From the bed came a soft cough, followed by Timothy's sleepy voice. "Mama." Hannah immediately went to him, feeling his forehead for fever. "I'm here, sweetheart. How do you feel?" "Thirsty," the boy mumbled. While Hannah tended to her son, Ethan moved to the window, watching the storm rage outside. The rain showed no signs of abating, and night was falling rapidly. He knew he should return to town, to the room he'd rented at the boarding house. But something kept him rooted in place: concern for the boy, certainly, but also a reluctance to leave Hannah alone. "Mr. Blackwell saved you from the river today," Hannah was explaining gently to Timothy, who was looking at Ethan with wide, solemn eyes. "Thank you, mister," the child said shyly. Ethan crossed to the bed, crouching to be at eye level with the boy. "You gave us quite a scare, Timothy. Think you can stay away from the river from now on?" Timothy nodded solemnly, then asked with a child's directness, "Are you staying for supper?" Ethan glanced at Hannah, who hesitated only briefly before saying, "Mr. Blackwell is welcome to stay if he wishes. The storm is only getting worse." "I should get back to town," Ethan said automatically, though he made no move to leave. "Please stay," Timothy said, grabbing Ethan's hand with surprising strength for a child who'd nearly drowned hours earlier. "Mama makes good stew." Hannah smiled at her son's endorsement. "It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome to share our meal. It's the least I can do." Outside, thunder crashed and the wind howled around the cabin's eaves. The decision made itself. "All right," Ethan agreed. "Thank you." As Hannah prepared a simple but hearty stew, Ethan entertained Timothy with stories of his travels across the territory. The boy, seemingly recovered from his ordeal, listened with rapt attention, asking questions about horses and cattle and the mountains Ethan had crossed. "You've seen a lot of places," Hannah commented as she set bowls of stew on the table. "Where do you call home?" Ethan helped Timothy to the table before answering. "Nowhere particular. Been drifting since the war ended. Worked ranches from Texas to Montana." "The war?" Hannah asked carefully. The conflict had ended 7 years ago, but its wounds were still raw for many. "Fought for the Union," Ethan said simply. "Came west after. Seemed easier than going back to Kentucky." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Timothy, despite his earlier energy, began to droop over his stew, his eyelids heavy. "I think someone's ready to return to bed," Hannah said fondly, lifting her son from his chair. "Say good night to Mr. Blackwell, Timothy." "G-night," the boy mumbled sleepily. "Will you be here tomorrow?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He looked to Hannah, who seemed equally uncertain how to respond. "Mr. Blackwell has his own business to attend to, sweetheart," she said gently, carrying Timothy back to bed. Once the boy was settled, Hannah returned to the table, clearing the dishes with efficient movements. "You don't need to answer that," she said quietly. "He's too young to understand that people don't stay." There was a resignation in her voice that struck Ethan unexpectedly. This young widow had already learned the harsh lesson that life offered no guarantees, that those you loved could be gone in an instant. "I'm headed north to deliver horses to Fort Laramie," he found himself saying. "But I'll be in Belmont for a few more days. Might check in on the boy if that's all right with you." Hannah looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "That's very kind but unnecessary. We've imposed on you enough." "It's no imposition," Ethan insisted. "Besides, I'd like to make sure he's fully recovered." A small smile touched Hannah's lips. "Then we'd welcome your visit." She hesitated, then added, "Timothy's father has been gone almost 6 months now. He misses having a man around." The implication hung in the air between them, not an invitation exactly, but an acknowledgement of need, of absence. Ethan nodded, understanding more than she'd put into words. "I'll come by tomorrow afternoon, then." The storm continued through the night, forcing Ethan to accept Hannah's offer to sleep on the small pallet by the fire. As he lay listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder, he found himself unusually aware of Hannah's presence just a few yards away, behind the thin privacy screen. He'd known many women in his travels, but something about this young widow's quiet strength and vulnerability stirred something protective in him that he hadn't felt in years. It was just concern for a woman and child alone, he told himself. Nothing more. In a few days, he'd ride north as planned, continuing the solitary existence that had become his comfort since the war. But as sleep finally claimed him, Ethan couldn't ignore the small voice in his mind suggesting that perhaps the Brazos River had changed more than just Hannah's life that day. Morning arrived with surprising brightness, the storm having cleared overnight to reveal a brilliant Colorado spring day. Hannah woke to find the pallet by the fire empty, Ethan's borrowed clothes folded neatly beside it. For a moment, she wondered if he'd changed his mind about returning, then chided herself for the disappointment that accompanied the thought. She had no claim on the cowboy's time or attention beyond his generous offer to check on Timothy. Timothy, thankfully, showed no ill effects from his ordeal. He chattered happily through breakfast, recounting Ethan's stories with embellishments of his own imagination. More than once, he asked when Mr. Ethan would return, and Hannah gently reminded him that their visitor might be busy with his own affairs. After breakfast, Hannah decided they should take advantage of the fine weather to tend the small garden plot behind the cabin. Working the soil helped settle her thoughts, which kept returning to Ethan Blackwell's steady gaze and the feeling of security she'd experienced in his presence, a feeling she hadn't known since Jacob's death. "Mama, look," Timothy suddenly exclaimed, pointing toward the road. "It's Mr. Ethan." Hannah straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. Sure enough, Ethan was approaching on his buckskin horse, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, a second horse pulled a small cart laden with lumber. "What on earth?" Hannah murmured, brushing soil from her hands as Ethan dismounted. "Good morning," he called, tipping his hat. "Brought something for your porch steps. Noticed yesterday they were rotting through." Hannah glanced at the sagging wooden steps that led to her cabin's door. They'd been deteriorating for months, but with so many other pressing needs, she hadn't been able to justify the expense of replacing them. "That's very thoughtful," she said, genuinely touched. "But I can't accept already bought the lumber," Ethan interrupted with a gentle firmness. "Besides, it's as much for my peace of mind as yours. Can't have Timothy taking another tumble." At the mention of his name, Timothy ran to Ethan's side, looking up at him with undisguised hero worship. "Are you going to build us new steps, Mr. Ethan?" "That's the plan, partner," Ethan said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Think you can help me?" Timothy's face lit up with importance. "I can help, I'm strong." "Never doubted it for a second," Ethan replied seriously. He looked to Hannah for permission, and after a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "At least let me pay you for the lumber," she said as Ethan began unloading the cart. "Consider it payment for supper and a dry place to sleep," he countered. When she started to protest again, he added more softly, "Please, Hannah, let me do this." Something in his tone, not pity, but a sincere desire to help, silenced her objections. "All right," she conceded, "but you'll stay for lunch at least." Ethan's smile was quick and warm. "Deal." For the next few hours, Hannah continued her garden work while keeping an eye on Ethan and Timothy. The cowboy showed surprising patience with the boy, allowing him to help by holding nails and fetching tools. His movements were efficient and skilled as he dismantled the old steps and began constructing new ones from the fresh lumber. When lunchtime arrived, Hannah called them to the shade of a large cottonwood tree, where she'd spread a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. Timothy immediately launched into an excited recounting of his morning as a carpenter's assistant, while Ethan listened with apparent interest, occasionally correcting the boy's more creative interpretations of events. "You're good with him," Hannah observed when Timothy ran off to chase a butterfly. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "He's a good kid, makes it easy." Still, not every man would take the time. Hannah hesitated, then asked, "Do you have children of your own somewhere?" "No," Ethan said, his expression unreadable. "Never married." "I'm surprised," Hannah said before she could stop herself. When Ethan raised an eyebrow, she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I just meant you seem like you'd make a good father." Something flashed in Ethan's eyes, regret perhaps, or an old pain. "Never stayed in one place long enough," he said after a moment. "Not fair to ask a woman to follow that kind of life." Hannah nodded, understanding. The West was full of drifters, men who moved from ranch to ranch, town to town, never putting down roots. Jacob had been the opposite, determined to build something permanent, something to pass on to their children. His death had left that dream in tatters, but Hannah clung to the land for Timothy's sake. It was all they had left of Jacob's vision. "What about you?" Ethan asked, changing the subject. "How are you managing the property on your own?" Hannah sighed, gesturing toward the modest garden and the overgrown fields beyond. "Not very well, I'm afraid. I've leased most of the grazing land to the Henderson Ranch. It's enough to keep us fed, but not much more." "You've got good water rights here," Ethan observed, looking toward the creek that bordered her property. "Land could support a decent herd." "Perhaps if I had the knowledge or means to raise cattle," Hannah said with a sad smile. "For now we survive." Ethan seemed about to say more when Timothy came running back, clutching wildflowers in his small fist. "For you, Mama," he announced proudly, thrusting them toward her. "Thank you, sweetheart," Hannah said, accepting the slightly crushed blooms. "They're beautiful." "Mr. Ethan, you can have one too," Timothy said, solemnly offering a single daisy to the cowboy. Ethan accepted it with equal gravity. "Much obliged, Timothy." To Hannah's surprise, he tucked the flower into his hatband before rising to his feet. "Better finish those steps before the day gets away from us." By late afternoon, the new porch steps were complete, solid, well-crafted, and far sturdier than the originals had ever been. Ethan had even added a small railing, explaining that it might help during winter when ice made the steps treacherous. "I don't know how to thank you," Hannah said as they stood admiring the finished work. Timothy had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was napping inside the cabin. "No need," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Glad to help." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of meadowlarks. Hannah was acutely aware that Ethan would soon leave, returning to town and eventually continuing north. The thought left an unexpected hollowness in her chest. "Would you?" She began hesitantly. "Would you like to stay for supper again?" Ethan's expression softened. "I'd like that very much." The meal that evening was livelier than the previous nights, with Timothy fully recovered and eager to share every thought that crossed his active mind. Hannah found herself laughing more than she had in months, caught up in the simple joy of companionship that had been so scarce since Jacob's death. As dusk fell and Timothy's chatter finally gave way to yawns, Ethan rose to leave. "Thank you for the meal," he said, gathering his hat. "I should get back to town." Hannah nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. "Of course, you've done more than enough for us today." "I meant what I said about checking on Timothy," Ethan added, pausing at the newly built steps. "If it's still all right, I'd like to stop by tomorrow." "We'd like that," Hannah said, and was rewarded with a smile that reached Ethan's eyes, softening the lines of his weathered face. As she watched him ride away, Hannah tried to temper the hope growing within her. Ethan Blackwell was passing through, nothing more. His kindness was appreciated, perhaps even life-changing, considering Timothy's rescue, but it would be foolish to read more into it than simple decency. Still, as she tucked Timothy into bed that night, she couldn't help but notice how the cabin felt emptier without Ethan's presence, or how her son's prayers now included a blessing for Mr. Ethan, who saved me from the river. True to his word, Ethan returned the following day and the day after that. Each visit brought some small improvement to Hannah's homestead: a repaired fence, a cleaned-out well, a patched roof. He brushed aside her concerns about imposing on his time, explaining that his business in town was concluded, and he was simply waiting for word from Fort Laramie before continuing north. Timothy blossomed under Ethan's attention, following the cowboy like a shadow, absorbing every bit of knowledge Ethan shared about horses, cattle, and survival in the Western Territories. For her part, Hannah found herself looking forward to their conversations during meals or in the evenings after Timothy was asleep: discussions about books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they'd held. A week passed, then two. The arrival of a telegram from Fort Laramie brought reality crashing back. Ethan was expected within the fortnight. He would need to leave Belmont within days. "When will you be back?" Timothy asked, when Ethan explained his impending departure. The boy's lower lip trembled despite his obvious effort to be brave. Ethan crouched to Timothy's level, his expression serious. "I can't say for certain, partner. My work takes me many places. But you will come back," Timothy persisted, his young face pinched with worry. Ethan glanced at Hannah, who stood watching the exchange with a carefully neutral expression, though her heart was anything but calm. "I'll try," Ethan said finally, ruffling Timothy's hair. "That's all I can promise." That night, after Timothy was asleep, Hannah found Ethan standing on the porch, staring at the stars that blanketed the Colorado sky. She joined him in silence, wrapping her shawl tighter against the spring night's chill. "He'll miss you," she said after a moment. "We both will." Ethan turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "These weeks have been unexpected." Hannah nodded, understanding all he didn't say. "Life has a way of surprising us, sometimes terribly, sometimes wonderfully." "Hannah," Ethan began, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm not good at staying in one place, never have been, but these past weeks—" He trailed off, searching for words. "I know you have obligations," Hannah said softly. "I would never ask you to abandon them." "That's just it," Ethan said, taking a step toward her. "For the first time in years, I find myself wanting to make new obligations, to stay." Hannah's heart quickened. "Ethan, let me finish," he said gently. "I've been drifting since the war, never finding a reason to stop, until I pulled a little boy from a river and met his remarkable mother." He took her hand then, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I need to deliver these horses to Fort Laramie. I gave my word and I won't break it, but if you're willing, I'd like to come back, not just to visit, to stay." Hannah's breath caught. "Are you certain?" "This is a simple life, far from excitement or adventure." Ethan's smile was tender. "I've had my fill of adventure. What I haven't had is a home, a family." He paused, his expression growing serious. "I know it hasn't been long since your husband passed." "I don't expect Jacob would want Timothy to have a father," Hannah interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. "And he would want me to find happiness again." She stepped closer, emboldened by the emotion she saw in Ethan's eyes. "Come back to us, Ethan. We'll be here waiting." Under the vast Colorado sky, Ethan Blackwell kissed Hannah Adams for the first time, a gentle, questioning kiss that held the promise of more to come. When they parted, both were smiling, their future suddenly rich with possibility. The morning of Ethan's departure dawned clear and bright. Hannah and Timothy stood in the yard, watching as he secured the last of his belongings to his saddle. "Remember what I told you about taking care of your mama while I'm gone," Ethan said to Timothy, who nodded solemnly. "I'll protect her," the boy promised, standing as tall as his little frame would allow. "I know you will, partner." Ethan ruffled Timothy's hair one last time before turning to Hannah. "6 weeks," he said. "8 at the most, then I'll be back." Hannah nodded, fighting tears. "We'll be counting the days." Ethan's kiss was brief but tender. "So will I." As he mounted his horse and led the string of remounts toward the northern trail, Hannah lifted Timothy onto her hip so he could wave until Ethan disappeared from sight. "He's coming back, Mama," Timothy said with a child's certainty. Mr. Ethan promised. "Yes, he did," Hannah agreed, hugging her son close, "and Mr. Ethan keeps his promises." The weeks of Ethan's absence passed slowly for Hannah and Timothy. They fell back into their familiar routines, tending the garden, caring for their few animals, making the occasional trip into Belmont for supplies. But now, there was a difference. Purpose and anticipation colored their days. Hannah found herself preparing for Ethan's return in small, meaningful ways. She sewed new curtains for the cabin windows, planted additional vegetables in the garden, and began clearing the small adjacent room that had been used for storage, envisioning it as Timothy's bedroom, giving her and Ethan privacy they would otherwise lack. The townsfolk of Belmont noticed the change in the young widow. Where once she had been politely distant, she now engaged more freely, even sharing her plans for expanding the homestead when Ethan returned. You've certainly taken a shine to that drifter, Mrs. Holloway, the mercantile owner's wife, commented during one of Hannah's visits to town. Her tone was light, but her eyes were concerned. "Known him long, have you?" "Long enough," Hannah replied, selecting a bolt of fabric for a new shirt she was planning for Ethan. "He saved my son's life." Gratitude can sometimes be mistaken for deeper feelings, Mrs. Holloway cautioned gently, especially when a woman's been alone as long as you have. Hannah met the older woman's gaze steadily. "It's not gratitude, Mrs. Holloway, or at least, not only gratitude." She smiled, fingering the blue fabric that matched Ethan's eyes. "Sometimes you just know when something's right." The older woman's expression softened. "Well, I hope you're right, dear. Lord knows you and Timothy deserve some happiness." As the 6th week of Ethan's absence approached, Hannah found herself watching the northern trail whenever she was outdoors, anticipation building with each passing day. Timothy, too, grew increasingly excited, asking each morning if today was the day Mr. Ethan would return. Then, on a warm afternoon as Hannah hung laundry while Timothy played nearby, the boy's shout made her turn sharply. "Mama, riders coming!" Hannah shaded her eyes, her heart leaping at the sight of mounted figures approaching. But as they drew closer, her excitement faded. There were 3 riders, none of them Ethan. Instead, it was Sheriff Cole Marshall from Belmont, accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize. "Afternoon, Mrs. Adams," the sheriff called as they approached. He removed his hat, a gesture that immediately put Hannah on alert. Men removed their hats in the presence of women, yes, but also when delivering bad news. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, unconsciously gathering Timothy close to her side. "What brings you out this way?" "This is Captain James Harrington and Lieutenant Robert Fisher from Fort Laramie," the sheriff said, indicating the 2 uniformed men with him. "They've come on a matter concerning Ethan Blackwell." Hannah's world narrowed to the grim expressions on the men's faces. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Captain Harrington spoke, his tone formal but not unkind. "Madam, I regret to inform you that Mr. Blackwell was involved in an incident while delivering horses to the fort. There was an attack by a group of renegade Sioux warriors. Mr. Blackwell was wounded defending the horse string." "Wounded," Hannah repeated, clinging to the word that meant he was still alive. "How severely? Where is he now?" "He's being treated at the fort infirmary," the captain continued. "He took an arrow to the shoulder and lost a considerable amount of blood. The post surgeon removed the arrowhead, but there was concern about infection." "He's asked for you," Lieutenant Fisher added quietly. "Repeatedly. That's why we've come. He gave us your name and location." Relief and fear warred within Hannah's chest. Ethan was alive but injured, possibly gravely, and he had asked for her not as a fleeting thought but with enough persistence that the army had sent men to find her. "I need to go to him," she said immediately. Sheriff Marshall nodded as if expecting this response. "That's why I've come along, Mrs. Adams. The journey to Fort Laramie is no small undertaking, especially with a child. But if you're determined, I'll see that you have an escort." Hannah's mind raced. Fort Laramie was at least a week's journey, possibly more with Timothy in tow. She would need supplies, arrangements for the homestead in her absence. "How soon can we leave?" she asked, decision made. "First light tomorrow," the captain suggested. "We've ridden hard to reach you and could use the night's rest. That will give you time to prepare." Hannah nodded, already mentally listing what needed to be done. "You're welcome to stay in our barn for the night, gentlemen. It's not much, but it's shelter." As the men saw to their horses, Hannah knelt before Timothy, who had been unusually quiet during the exchange. "Mr. Ethan is sick," she explained gently. "We need to go help him get better. Would you like that?" Timothy nodded solemnly. Is Mr. Ethan going to die like Papa? The question caught Hannah off guard, a sharp reminder that her son, despite his young age, understood loss all too well. "No, sweetheart," she said, praying she spoke the truth. "The doctors are helping him, and we're going to help too. Mr. Ethan is strong just like you." That night, after Timothy was asleep, Hannah packed efficiently by lamplight. Clothes, food for the journey, her small store of medical supplies, and a few precious mementos, including the daguerreotype of Jacob that she kept on the small table by her bed. She found herself talking to her late husband as she worked, something she hadn't done in months. "I didn't expect this, Jacob," she whispered. "Didn't expect him. But I think you would approve. He's a good man, steady, kind to Timothy. Different from you in many ways, but similar in the ones that matter." She paused, touching the image of Jacob's face. "I'll always love you, always honor what we had, but my heart has room for Ethan too if he lives." The "if" hung heavy in the air as Hannah finally sought her own rest, knowing tomorrow would bring the beginning of the most uncertain journey she had undertaken since leaving Missouri as a new bride. The party set out at dawn. Hannah and Timothy, in a small wagon borrowed from a neighboring farmer, escorted by the sheriff and the 2 soldiers. Timothy, excited by the adventure despite its serious purpose, kept up a steady stream of questions about the fort, soldiers, and the territories they would cross. Their journey took them north through increasingly rugged country. Each night as they made camp, Hannah found herself staring at the stars, wondering if Ethan was looking at the same constellations from his sick, or if he was even still conscious. The thought that he might die before she reached him was an agony she could scarcely bear. On the 6th day, as they crested a rise, Captain Harrington pointed ahead. "Fort Laramie, madam. We'll be there by nightfall." Hannah's heart leapt at the sight of the distant outpost, a collection of buildings nestled in the valley below, so close now to Ethan for better or worse. As they approached the fort gates in the fading light, Hannah smoothed Timothy's hair and straightened her own travel-worn clothes. She wanted to look strong for Ethan, not exhausted and afraid. The fort surgeon, Dr. Lewis Montgomery, met them at the infirmary door, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Adams?" he inquired, offering his hand. "I've been caring for Mr. Blackwell. He'll be most relieved to see you." "Then he's—" Hannah couldn't finish the question. "Alive, yes," Dr. Montgomery confirmed. "The infection in his wound has been severe, but he's shown remarkable resilience. His fever broke just yesterday." Relief made Hannah's knees weak. Timothy, sensing her emotion, pressed closer to her side. "May we see him?" she asked. "Of course. But I should prepare you he's quite weak still, and the wound was significant. He may not regain full use of his left arm." Hannah nodded, absorbing this information. "We'll adjust," she said simply. The doctor led them to a small, separate room off the main infirmary, ward, a privilege granted due to Ethan's service in delivering horses to the fort despite the attack. There, on a narrow bed, lay Ethan Blackwell. He was paler than Hannah had ever seen him, his normally sun-bronzed face ashen against the white pillows. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged, and his frame seemed diminished somehow, as if the injury had taken more than blood. "Ethan," she said softly, moving to his bedside. His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly. When he registered her presence, a smile transformed his haggard face. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse, "you came." "Of course I came," she replied, taking his right hand carefully. "We both did." Timothy peered at Ethan from Hannah's side, his expression solemn. "Are you going to get better, Mr. Ethan?" "Already am, partner," Ethan assured him, though the effort of speaking was clearly taxing. "Now that you two are here." Dr. Montgomery cleared his throat gently. "I'll leave you to visit, but please keep it brief for tonight. Mr. Blackwell needs his rest, and I imagine you do as well after your journey." Once the doctor had gone, Hannah sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, still holding his hand. "You promised to come back to us," she said, her voice catching. "I intend to hold you to that." Ethan's fingers tightened weakly around hers. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Should have been more careful." "Hush," Hannah admonished gently. "The captain told us what happened. You saved 2 soldiers during that attack at great risk to yourself. That's who you are, Ethan Blackwell, the man who dives into danger to save others." She smiled tremulously. "First my son, now your comrades." "Not very sensible of me," Ethan admitted, his eyes never leaving her face as if memorizing it anew. "No," Hannah agreed, "but very brave, very honorable." She leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "And very loved." The word hung between them, honest and unadorned. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Hannah," he began, but she shook her head. "Rest now," she said. "We have time for words later. We're not going anywhere until you're well enough to travel home with us." "Home," Ethan repeated, the word a question and a prayer combined. "Yes," Hannah confirmed. "Home, to Belmont." In the days that followed, Hannah and Timothy became fixtures at Fort Laramie. The commanding officer, impressed by Ethan's actions during the attack and moved by Hannah's devotion, arranged quarters for them near the infirmary. Timothy quickly became a favorite among the soldiers, who taught him military drills and let him help care for the horses in the stables. Hannah spent most of her time with Ethan, whose recovery progressed steadily under her care. She changed his bandages, helped him take the bitter medicines Dr. Montgomery prescribed, and read to him from books borrowed from the fort's small library. In the evenings, when Timothy joined them, Ethan would summon the energy to tell stories of his travels, delighting the boy with tales of mountains, deserts, and plains. As Ethan's strength returned, so did his determination to keep his promise to Hannah. "The doctor says I can travel in another week," he told her one afternoon as they sat together in the fort's small garden. "Light duties only for a few months after that, but I'll heal." "And your arm?" Hannah asked. She had noticed that Ethan still had limited mobility in his left shoulder, despite diligent exercises. Ethan flexed his fingers, wincing slightly. "Better every day. May never be what it was, but I can still ride, still work." He looked at her directly. "Still build a life, if that's what you're wondering," Hannah smiled, taking his hand. "I never doubted it." "Hannah," Ethan said, his expression growing serious, "I've had a lot of time to think, lying in that infirmary bed, about what I want, what I can offer you and Timothy." "And what conclusions did you reach?" Hannah asked, her heart quickening. "That I love you," Ethan said simply. "That I want to marry you if you'll have me, build that ranch you and Jacob dreamed of, be a father to Timothy." He paused, his grip on her hand tightening. "I know it hasn't been long," Hannah stopped him with a finger to his lips. "Time isn't always measured in days or weeks, Ethan. Sometimes it's measured in moments that change us forever." She smiled softly. "The moment you pulled my son from the river. The moment you built new steps for a widow's cabin. The moment I received word you were injured and realized I couldn't bear to lose you." She leaned forward, replacing her finger with her lips in a gentle kiss. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed at Fort Laramie 2 days before their departure, in a simple ceremony presided over by the fort chaplain. Timothy stood proudly at Ethan's side, appointed best man for the occasion. The soldiers and their wives attended, along with several of the officers who had come to respect Ethan during his recovery. Hannah wore a dress borrowed from the commander's wife, with wildflowers in her hair gathered by Timothy that morning. Ethan, still thin from his ordeal but standing tall, wore his best shirt with his left arm supported by a sling the surgeon had insisted upon for the journey home. "I, Ethan Blackwell, take you, Hannah Adams, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice strong and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Hannah repeated the vows, her heart full to bursting. When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, Timothy cheered louder than anyone, throwing his arms around both of them in a jubilant embrace that drew laughter from the assembled guests. That night, after a small reception hosted by the commander and his wife, Ethan and Hannah stood together outside their temporary quarters. Timothy was already asleep inside, exhausted by the day's excitement. "Mrs. Blackwell," Ethan said, testing the name on his tongue, "has a fine sound to it." Hannah leaned against his uninjured side, content. "Indeed it does, Mr. Blackwell. Are you ready for the journey home tomorrow?" Ethan asked, his arm tightening around her waist. "More than ready," Hannah replied, "though I'm grateful for the kindness we've been shown here." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Fort Laramie will always hold a special place in my memory now, not for the injury, but for what came after finding you and Timothy at my bedside, knowing you came all that way for me." Hannah turned in his embrace, careful of his healing shoulder. "I would have gone twice as far," she said softly. "You gave me back my son's life, Ethan. Then you gave me back my own." Under a sky brilliant with stars, husband and wife shared a kiss that sealed their vows far more deeply than any words spoken before witnesses. It was a promise of the life to come, one built not on the ashes of past tragedy, but on the foundation of hope that had begun the day a river nearly took everything from Hannah, only to deliver unexpected blessings instead. The journey back to Belmont was slower than their northward trek had been, accommodating Ethan's still healing body. They traveled in the same wagon, now laden with wedding gifts from the fort residents' blankets, kitchen implements, books, and even a fine saddle for Ethan, presented by the commander himself in recognition of his bravery. Timothy, officially adopted by Ethan on their wedding day, chattered endlessly about the adventures awaiting them at home. He had taken to calling Ethan Pa naturally, as if the title had always belonged to him, and Ethan received it with visible emotion each time. When they finally crested the rise that revealed Hannah's now their homestead in the distance, all three fell silent for a moment, taking in the sight of the modest cabin with new eyes. "Needs work," Ethan observed finally. "Good thing I'm handy with tools." Hannah laughed, squeezing his hand. "And I'm grateful for it, though you're not to overdo things until that shoulder is fully healed." "Yes, madam," Ethan agreed with a grin, "though there's plenty I can manage one-handed in the meantime." Upon reaching the cabin, they found it had been cared for in their absence. The garden had been weeded, the animals tended, and a welcome basket of food sat on the porch, evidence of the community's support during their journey. That night, after Timothy was asleep in his newly arranged bedroom, Hannah and Ethan stood on the porch beneath the stars, much as they had the night before he'd left for Fort Laramie. But now they were husband and wife, their future stretching before them like the vast Colorado sky. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his arm around Hannah's waist, "about what to call this place." "Oh," Hannah looked up at him, curious. "It's always just been the Adams place." "Well, now it's the Blackwell place," Ethan pointed out, "but I was thinking of something more fitting." "How about Riverbank Ranch?" Hannah considered the name, understanding its significance. "Because of the river, where it all began." Ethan nodded. "Seems right to honor the place that brought us together, even if it was in such a frightening way." "Riverbank Ranch," Hannah repeated, smiling. "I like it." In the months that followed, Ethan made good on his promise to build the ranch Jacob had envisioned. With his military pay and the money from the horses he delivered to Fort Laramie, they purchased a small herd of cattle and additional acreage along the creek. Ethan's arm healed better than the doctor had predicted, though cold weather always brought an ache that reminded him of those days in the fort infirmary. By the following spring, Hannah had news of her own to share. She told Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Timothy help the new ranch hand corral a calf that had wandered from its mother. "A baby," Ethan repeated when Hannah shared her suspicion, his face transformed with wonder and joy. "You're certain, Doctor?" "Wilson confirmed it yesterday in town," Hannah said, placing Ethan's hand over her still flat stomach. "He says the baby should arrive by late autumn." Ethan gathered her close, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I never thought," he began, then had to clear his throat. "After the war, I never thought I'd have a family of my own. Now I have Timothy, you, and soon another little one." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, though his expression left little doubt. "Happier than I've ever been," Ethan assured her, kissing her deeply. "Happier than I ever thought possible." Their daughter, Rebecca Grace Blackwell, was born on a crisp October evening, with Dr. Wilson attending and Ethan pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door with Timothy. She arrived with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair like her father's, gripping Ethan's finger with surprising strength when he was finally allowed to hold her. "She's perfect," he whispered, awestruck, as Timothy peered at his new sister with cautious interest. "She looks wrinkly," Timothy observed, making Hannah laugh despite her exhaustion. "All babies look that way at first," she assured him, "but she'll smooth out and you'll be the best big brother a girl could ask for." Life at Riverbank Ranch settled into a rhythm of seasons. The cattle herd grew, as did the family's prosperity. Ethan's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spread throughout the territory, bringing offers of partnership and investment that allowed them to expand further. Timothy thrived under Ethan's guidance, growing into a responsible boy who took his duties on the ranch seriously, while maintaining the joyful spirit that had captured Ethan's heart from the beginning. Rebecca, or Becky as she was quickly nicknamed, became her father's shadow, following him about the ranch from the moment she could walk, her dark curls bouncing with each determined step. When Becky was 2, Hannah gave birth to their son, William Jacob Blackwell, Will to the family. The boy had Hannah's golden hair and Ethan's steady gaze, and from an early age showed a gift for working with horses that made his father beam with pride. On the 5th anniversary of the day, Ethan had pulled Timothy from the Brazos River. The family held a special celebration. The ranch hands were given the day off with pay, and neighbors from miles around were invited for a feast prepared by Hannah with help from the wives of nearby ranchers. As twilight fell, Ethan found Hannah standing by the creek that bordered their property, a tributary of the Brazos that had once inspired such fear, but now provided life-giving water for their land and cattle. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, coming to stand beside her. Hannah smiled, leaning against her husband's solid frame. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if Timothy hadn't fallen into the river that day. If I hadn't been in town delivering cattle," Ethan added, his arm tightening around her waist. "It's strange to think that the most frightening moment of my life led to the greatest happiness," Hannah mused. From the direction of the house came the sound of children's laughter. Timothy, now 8, entertaining his younger siblings with some game of his invention. "Do you ever regret settling down?" Hannah asked suddenly, looking up at Ethan. "Giving up your freedom to roam?" Ethan's answer was immediate and certain, not for a single moment. He turned Hannah to face him fully. The day I pulled Timothy from that river, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for: a reason to stop drifting, a place to belong." He kissed her then, a kiss still filled with the same passion and tenderness that had marked their first embrace years earlier. "Besides," he added with a smile when they parted, "I've got all the adventure I could want right here. 3 children, 60 head of cattle, and the most beautiful wife in the Colorado Territory. If that's not excitement, I don't know what is." Hannah laughed, taking his hand as they turned back toward their home, where lanterns glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. "Well, when you put it that way, Mr. Blackwell, I can see why you stay." "Forever," Ethan promised, kissing her once more before they rejoined their family and friends. "For as long as the Brazos flows, and far beyond." Years later, when Riverbank Ranch had grown to become one of the most prosperous in the territory, visitors would often ask how Ethan and Hannah Blackwell had met. The story became something of a legend in Belmont: the tale of a mother's desperation, a cowboy's courage, and the river that had brought them together. Timothy, grown into a fine young man who worked the ranch alongside his father, never tired of telling it. "My father saved me from the Brazos River when I was just a little feller," he would say proudly, though in truth Ethan was his adoptive father. But in all the ways that mattered in love, guidance, and unwavering support, Ethan Blackwell was every inch Timothy's pa. Rebecca, as spirited and determined as both her parents, would often add dramatically, "And then he saved Pa's life too when the Sioux attacked. Ma rode all the way to Fort Laramie to nurse him back to health." Young Will, the quietest of the Blackwell children but missing nothing, would sometimes conclude, "That's why they named it Riverbank Ranch, because the river brought our family together." And Hannah and Ethan, listening to their children retell the story that had become family lore, would exchange glances filled with the quiet understanding of two people who had discovered that sometimes the worst moments in life can lead to the greatest blessings if you have the courage to dive into the dangerous waters and the faith to believe in the possibility of rescue. For Hannah, who had once watched in terror as the Brazos River threatened to take everything she loved, the water that flowed past their prosperous ranch had become not a symbol of loss, but a constant reminder of hope found, love restored, and a family built on the foundation of one man's selfless courage. A cowboy who had dove into raging waters and brought back not just her son, but the promise of a future brighter than she could have ever imagined.